Happy April Fool's Day, my fellow nerds. Today's a big day for me, as not only are you guys getting a Resident Evil related video, but earlier in the day, my second channel premiered that focuses on horror movies. So if that channel interests you at all, be sure to check it out. The link to the channel will be in the description, plus you'll see my first ever video for that channel at the end of this video. Spoiler, it focuses on recent horror movies with the best twists. But I know you guys are not really here for that. You're here for another Resident Evil ranking video. And since today is April Fool's Day, I tried to get a little creative with the list. Keyword, tried. On this episode of Nerdspace, I'm taking a look at 10 times Resident Evil bosses were like, nah, I ain't gonna even try taking on the boulder punching Chris or a Jill sandwich today. Basically, it's 10 times where the game was pretty much like, here comes a boss fight and psych, April Fools, it's actually a skippable boss fight. I know, that's kind of a stretch, but go with it. So essentially, I'm looking at my favorite skippable boss fights of the RE franchise. Whether that is in the form of just running past them or solving a chemical puzzle while letting someone else do the heavy lifting. These bosses can be skipped completely without firing a single shot. Well, maybe one shot is required. Oh, and obviously, I'm not counting encounters with stalker enemies since, for the most part, all of their encounters can be avoided without any sort of confrontation except for the main fights against them. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 skippable boss fights of Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Gulp Worm, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Honestly, giant worms and snakes are kind of a staple in the Resident Evil franchise. Take the Gulp Worm, for example. In Code Veronica, both Claire and Chris Redfield eventually find themselves coming across one. And while Chris has no choice but to fight the giant, disgusting worm-like creature, Claire actually has the ability to just run like hell. While exploring Rockford Island, Claire eventually comes face to face with the Gulp Worm. But even though there is a cutscene that sets up this encounter, the fact is that Claire isn't stuck in this area. Unlike most boss encounters in other video games, the doors are unlocked and Claire is free to just get the fuck out of there. Sure, that means the Gulp Worm will still be there when you find yourself backtracking later, but with the amount of resources it'll take you to defeat it anyway, you'll find that killing it is far from beneficial and it's easier to just let Chris deal with it. Hell, even if you manage to kill the damn thing as Claire, Chris will still have to fight it later on anyway, so it seems counterproductive to fight it twice when you don't have to. Number 9, Yawn, Resident Evil. Speaking of giant snakes and worms, let's take a look at the other side of the coin, shall we? If you've been a Resident Evil fan as long as I have, then chances are that the Yawn was your first ever boss fight of the franchise. Coming across this giant snake inside of the attic of the Spencer mansion, this thing is massive and almost takes up the entire battlefield. Because it's your first time playing the game, and unless you had a walkthrough, you might have thought that you had no choice but to kill this son of a bitch. But just like the Gulp Worm before it, Yawn doesn't have to be fought here. In fact, it makes a lot more sense to not fight him since you'll have to do it later on regardless of what happens here. Instead, if you direct your attention to the opposite side of the room, you'll find the key item that you need to progress the story. Go straight for that item, dodge the giant snake's attacks, and run back to the same door that you entered the room from, and that's about it. Not only does skipping the fight itself save you time and resources, but if you manage to do it without receiving any damage, then you can skip past the entire segment where you'll need to retrieve the antidote. Win-win in my book, it seems. Number 8, Albinoid, Resident Evil Code Veronica. We're back with yet another Code Veronica boss, and spoiler, it won't be the last. This time we look at the Albinoid. While teasing Claire's playthrough of Rockford Island, you don't actually come face to face with the adult version of this creature until Chris visits the island. While searching for the Blue Eagle plate, Chris will find this creature straight out of a sci-fi horror movie enjoying a nice pool day in a small square pond. Unfortunately, the plate that you need is in the center of this pond, and the Albinoid will electrocute the fuck out of you if you get in the water. So at first glance, you might think, alright, time to shoot the motherfucker. Well, not exactly. While you can waste precious limited resources to kill the thing, as it doesn't take too long to kill, to me, it's more easier to just get in the water and grab the plate. Sure, it's going to electrocute you a few times, and there's a good chance that you'll need to heal afterwards, but unless you sit still in that water and actively go out of your way to let the thing electrocute you to death, it's fairly simple to just get what you need and get out before any real harm can be done. And it's much better than wasting ammo on it when bullets in this game are more limited than most Resident Evil titles. Number 7, Popokarimu, Resident Evil 5. In the action horror trilogy, aka RE4 through RE6, most boss fights are not skippable. However, in Resident Evil 5, there is a single boss that you can bypass the second time you come across it. That of course is the Popokarimu. God, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Anyway, this beast is first seen while exploring the mines in which it flies around and attacks the players. But while this fight can't really be skipped, the second time you come across it can be. At the very end of chapter 4.1, just before you make a run for the exit, this flying beast will appear once again. Even though it seems like you might have to fight it again since it appears to be blocking your path, you actually don't need to kill it. Instead, you can conserve your resources and make a beeline for the stairs leading out of the cave. You do still need to run up the stairs as it tries to attack you, and as you get closer to the exit, you'll need to mash a button, but unless you're trying to get a little more gold or get that all treasure achievement, then there really is no reason to kill the thing, and it's faster to just skip it completely. Number 6, Giant Black Widow, Code Veronica. Really, there's two games that stand out for having the most skippable boss fights of the franchise. One of those games is Code Veronica, as it has not one, not two, but 3 skippable boss fights. This time we take a look at the Giant Black Widow. Once again, Chris is the one that'll come face to face with it. All you really need to do here is to retrieve the emerald near Alexander's body. Once you have that, you can haul ass out of there. Which honestly, you probably should, as the spider is pretty quick and can poison Chris, which can become a real pain to fight. For some reason, despite having some of the most difficult boss fights of the franchise, Code Veronica also has a lot of skippable ones. Perhaps it's a way to help balance out the difficulty a little bit. Number 5, Black Tiger, Resident Evil. From one spider to another, we now find ourselves back inside the Spencer Mansion. We're technically under it as we take a look at Black Tiger, which lies inside the caves under the Spencer Mansion. Out of all the skippable boss fights on this list, Black Tiger is probably one of the harder ones to skip. As you're exploring the caves under the mansion, you'll find yourself in a small area with webs all over. As you enter, a cutscene will play out where Black Tiger will make his way over towards the player from the ceiling. While it might be easier to take on Black Tiger thanks to blue herbs being nearby for you to use after the fight, some speedrunners choose to make a beeline for the exit instead of taking him on. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as opening a door, as the exit has webs all over it. In order to escape it, you'll need to use either a knife or a flamethrower to get through all of the webs on the door. Once the door is cleared of webs, you can exit out of it without dealing any damage to Black Tiger. Again, it's probably a lot easier to just kill him than it is to skip the fight completely, but know that the option is there if you choose to do so. Number 4, El Gigante, Resident Evil 4. El Gigante are troll-like monsters that you'll face off against a few times while playing Resident Evil 4. While most of the encounters with them are mandatory, there is one that can be skipped in the original game. After completing the cabin fight with Luis, Leon will find a file that discusses the plans to secure the only 2 exits that lead out of the village. While one path leads to a lot of enemies, the other is only guarded by one of those giant trolls. So you can actually avoid this entire fight just by choosing the other path. However, that's not the only way to skip this fight. Even if you do take the path with the cave troll, you don't have to kill him. You can choose to move quickly through the locked doors and reach the other side before he deals any damage. Note that it might be easier to stun him a few times with the boulders above you, but as long as you're careful and cautious, you should be able to reach the other side without having to face him head on. Number 3, Tyrant, Resident Evil. I could be completely wrong and you guys can correct me if I am, but I believe the Tyrant in Resident Evil is the only final boss that can be skipped. Well, sort of. You can at least skip his final phase, which is actually pretty great since his final phase is probably the second hardest fight of the game. Anyway, the Tyrant technically has 2 phases, one of which takes place in a lab after Wesker releases it. This fight is not skippable, but honestly, it's so damn easy that I really don't see why you would skip it anyway. The second phase of this fight is significantly more difficult as it's able to move quickly and deal a massive amount of damage with its charge attack. Luckily, this fight is completely skippable to the point where it won't even show up to fight you as long as you made certain choices throughout the game. See, in order to skip this fight, you have to be a cold-hearted son of a bitch. That's because in order to skip this fight, you have to let Rebecca and Barry die depending on who you are playing as, and you also have to choose not to rescue Chris or Jill. Being the lone survivor of the Spencer Mansion allows you to leave with Brad without having to deal with the final boss fight on the helipad. So I hope it was worth it, you selfish prick. Number 2, Giant Alligator, Resident Evil 2. One of my favorite features of the original RE2 game was the zapping system. Something that the remake did not completely include in its version of the game. The original RE2 zapping system allowed the player to make certain decisions that influence your second playthrough. Some were as simple as choosing a machine gun or a side pack, while others affected an additional boss fight of the Scenario B campaign. Focusing on the latter, there was a boss fight that could be skipped completely in Scenario B depending on how the player handled the fight against it in Scenario A. That boss, of course, being the giant alligator. While exploring the sewer, Leon or Claire will encounter a giant alligator while trying to reunite with either Ada or Sherry. This, of course, leads to a fight against this alligator in a long and narrow hallway. While the player could simply shoot the alligator enough, most players would finish it off by letting it gobble up a gas canister and then shooting that, blowing its head off. Funny enough, doing it this way also provided an extra benefit that the player may not have realized unless they took a longer approach of killing it. See, if the player chooses to kill the giant alligator by shooting the gas canister and blowing its head off, then the alligator will not appear in Scenario B. However, if they defeated it by dealing enough damage to it and it ran away, then the player will have to face it a second time in Scenario B. This is probably the most skipped boss fight of the franchise because most players would kill the alligator with the gas canister without even realizing the added benefit of it until later on. Number 1, Plant 42, Resident Evil Remake. Probably the most complicated way to skip a boss fight, Plant 42 can be defeated without you firing a single shot. Sure, you'll need to do an additional step before entering the room where it's located, and it can only be skipped completely in Jill's campaign, but considering that this thing is probably the hardest boss fight of the game, it's definitely worth doing the work to skip it. As I said, only Jill can skip the fight completely in the remake. That's because Rebecca will only skip the first phase for Chris, whereas Jill can skip the fight completely. In order to skip the fight, Jill will need to mix chemicals to create the V-Jolt. After doing so, she'll need to head to the roots of the plant and pour the V-Jolt on it. Once that's done, Jill will skip the first phase as soon as she walks into the room. Then instead of a second phase, Jill will be attacked by Plant 42 and Barry will show up with a flamethrower. After burning the fuck out of the plant, phase 2 is skipped as well, therefore allowing Jill to skip the entire fight completely. While Chris can skip the first phase of the fight using Rebecca, he's unable to skip the second phase of the fight no matter what he does. But that does it for today's episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what other boss fights can be skipped. I know off the top of my head that I missed a few of them, but I wanted to make a top 10 list, so I narrowed it down to my top 10 favorite ones to skip. But let me know down below which ones should have been included on today's list. Anyway, once again, I want to remind you guys that my second channel premiered today with my top 10 recent horror movie twists. I'd love to know what you guys think about it, and I appreciate any and all support you guys can bring to that new channel. So if you're into horror movies and you would like to see rankings on different topics relating to horror movies once per week, then please consider subscribing to that channel. Link is in the description below. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.